Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to this postmortem of my Blitz game number 962. My opponent started off here with e4 and I went e6, the French defense. He goes d4 and I go d5. So we get one of the main lines here. You can see he's playing all the main moves, including knight c3, which lets me get into a Winawer. Of course, the Winawer is not the only way to play this. You can also play for a closed position with knight to f6. But I think the Winawer with bishop b4 is quite interesting. He pushes on with e5, the main move. I play c5, going after the center, and he kicks the bishop. So you can see we've all played the main moves up to this point. I take his knight, he takes back with the pawn. And now here's the first place where I deviate from the main line of the Winawer. The main line here is knight e7, and just to show you a little bit of this line, he can come out with queen g4, and you can play queen c7 at this point and allow the queen to come in and take. That's a very interesting line. Or you can castle, and then he can try and build up on the king side. And we'll see that it looks a little shaky on the king side at first, but it just turns out that the king, helped with this knight, is okay here. So black continues to develop with knight b6, queen h5, ganging up on the h7 pawn. And, black could have preempted this by pushing the c-pawn forward, but black doesn't really want to do that in this position. He wants to keep some play in the center. Since black has already castled, closing the center would actually give white a free hand and would allow white to develop his attack slowly, and that would be pretty good for white. So you want to keep this open and keep some counterplay going on the queen side here. Anyway, let's see. Yeah, knight g6. After the queen comes over here threatening h7, you just interfere with the attack by putting the knight on g6. He can develop his knight at this point. And now the queen comes to c7. The other point I wanted to make is this is often a good square for the knight, for the queen anyway. The queen can defend along this rank, and then it can also potentially attack on this file, especially the c3 pawn is a soft target in many cases. Anyway, let's go back to the game. In this position, I took the second choice here, which is queen c7 right away. And let's see, he can continue with queen g4. We get lines like we saw previously, or he could continue with knight to f3, but he played f4 here. So we're in kind of a rare line. Yeah, I continued with knight to c6. Oh, yeah, I guess I wanted to show you the idea with this. Another idea with this queen c7 is if the queen comes out here to g4, you can play the move f5. You can also play knight e7 and transpose into a line where the queen comes in and takes the g-pawn. And as I mentioned before, so that's just a way of getting back into a line that would have started with knight e7. But to stay in unique lines, you can play f5, kick the queen back. And now looking at this most recently with the chess engine, it actually likes white quite a bit here. So this is maybe a bit of a risky way to play. But anyway, this is the kind of position where anything can happen because it's complicated enough. The check here actually is not very dangerous because the queen just comes over to block the check. So actually, queen to g3 here, like they show in the database, the top move in the database, is actually the best move for white. And white has a pretty significant edge here, actually, so according to the chess engine. So just a warning to you if you want to play this way. You might get into some trouble here, but it still leads to interesting play. Let's see. In the game, I went queen c7. He didn't do any of these exciting lines with queen g4. He just played f4. And I went knight c6, and he went knight f3. So at this point, knight ge7 is the move, but b6 seems to be okay as well, and we're just out of the book at this point. Let's see, there was one other line I wanted to show you back here. Instead of f5, let's erase the arrows, back up. Yeah, no, after f5, queen g3, yeah, there were a couple of options. One was taking and one was playing the knight to e7. We can get into one of these lines where the queen takes. I just wanted to show this idea once. You play the rook here to hit the queen. It gets two pawns, but then you take here and threaten to take another pawn, and you're also threatening queen to c3 check. So you have some counterplay in this line, but anyway, it's kind of a crazy line to play. So anyway, he declined to go in for that. He went f4. I went knight c6. He went knight f3, and I went b6, and we're just out of the book at this point. And the chess engine likes white here. It likes the extra space, and I still have to sort out my king side a bit. But it doesn't like white's next move. It doesn't like g4. It would just continue developing with bishop to d3. That seems to be fine. So after g4, it wants to play very actively. I missed a chance here, really. It wants to play h5. I'm always reluctant to even think about moves like this because my king is still in the center. But in fact, it's a fine time to play this. He doesn't really want to take and help me develop my my rook, and it also secures a square on f5 for my knight. So if he doesn't take, probably pushing on. That was a chess engine recommendation. But then this knight still gets to the f4 square. And notice that he can't just defend the pawn there with h3, because then I can take, and there's a pin on the h-file. So this h5 move is a real good move here. And I missed that. So I just played the normal kind of move. I pushed on with c4. I decided at this point he's launching a pawn storm against the king side, so I'm going to go queen side. And at that point, then I do want to close the center. Closing the center is a bad idea if your king is over here getting attacked, but if it can escape to the queen side, it's not so bad. But c4, I had the better move in h5. But otherwise, it's okay. Let's see. He went bishop h3 here. I went bishop to d7, just preparing to castle. He castles, I castle. He goes knight to g5. So that's a little bit of an uncomfortable move, attacking my undefended f7 pawn. But I think this is a reasonable defense. Knight to h6 holds on to the f7 square. Plays queen e1, and that's actually a very interesting move. It has more oomph behind it than I realized. And I immediately blunder here with f6. So right here, the chess engine is saying I should play king b7, just finish getting my king to safety before playing f6. It's interesting in the French, sometimes you play this f6 move early on, and sometimes you play it later. You almost always want to play it at some time or other, but you have to be careful when you play it. And the problem with playing it right here is that he can just take. And now the queen, being on the e-file, is actually looking at this pawn, and the knight is looking at that pawn. And I just can't hold the center here. He's just going to break through. Let's see. If I take back, the knight will take, and he's threatening the queen and the rook, so I have to take, and then the queen comes in with check. My king can step aside to safety, but he's won a pawn. He's going to maybe get another here. His bishops are going to start wreaking havoc once he pushes these pawns out of the way. So yeah, this is all looking good for white. so f6 here was a big mistake, and let's see, trying to defend the center doesn't work either. Let's see, after f6 he takes. I mean, if I could take a move to defend like this, he just wins another pawn here, and so he's just 2 pawns up. Maybe I'll manage to recapture one of those. Maybe I would survive a little longer in this line, but it's still good for white. So f6 was a big mistake here. And but white returned the favor by retreating the knight instead of calculating that out. I think that wasn't too hard to see, so I think he should have spent some time rather than retreating automatically. That's often the mark of a strong player. You attack his pieces, you think they're going to retreat, and they don't retreat. He finds some way to keep them there. And here it was pretty easy to find a way to maintain that knight on an active post. Let's see. I went knight f3. I went rook d to g8. So I'm just concentrating my forces on the king side. I want to get in this move g5. But his queen comes over to h4 first, and that stops my plan because of the pressure of the queen on my knight. I can't push the g-pawn forward. It has to be defended. So I moved the knight out of the way to f7. The chess engine likes f5 here and thinks, well, if he takes, then I can take back with the knight. That looks okay. I've got a secure square for my knight on f5, and I'm hitting his queen. So he pushes on, and then the knight comes back to f7. But, well, this is a very closed position, but maybe I need to close the position just to survive the attack over here on the king side. But that wasn't really the way I was thinking at this point in the game. I was thinking, open things up with my rooks against his king. So I played knight f7. He went on with g5 now. So I took, finally getting some kind of open line, although it's the f file. It's not the line I hope to open, but I push on with h6, and this is starting to open up the h file here. And he just pushed on with g6. So I had thought about this move and decided that it was okay for me to play knight to g5, because after he takes, I'll take back with the pawn, and then he'll have to move the queen, so he doesn't get to take the pawn. I had already calculated that out, and then he took the pawn anyway. So let's see. He could have played queen g3, defending his bishop, and he can probably still, his other bishop is still hitting this pawn, so he's probably going to round that up at some point. Anyway, he just needs to secure this the bishop somehow, and then he can round up the pawn, and he should be a little bit ahead, although this is a position I could survive and play on, so an interesting position still. But after he takes, it's actually winning for me, although he did do a good job of making it complicated. So he gave up the piece, but then he brought his rook into f7, and he's got a pin on my bishop here. So if he had another piece, like a bishop that I just took, he could get some pressure on that e6. But it's a little tricky with the remaining forces. But it's also a bit awkward for me. I couldn't quite figure out how I wanted to mobilize my pieces. First I offered the queen trade, which would help me out a lot. But he just drops back and kicks my rook. And I played rook takes c3 here. Chess Engine likes rook to h4. I guess I like that better too in retrospect. Just keep chasing that queen around, because the rook over here on c3 was a bit disconnected from the rest of my forces, although I did manage to make use of it later. And this still, keeps a winning advantage to black. I'm still just a piece up, and white will need a couple of moves to organize his attack. But it starts to come pretty fast here. Bishop to g5, kicking my queen. Then rook to c1. So he's done the right thing here. He's got all his pieces into the attack. But oh, he didn't play rook a to f1. He played rook to c1. That's right. He defended the pawn. Yeah, maybe rook a to f1 would have been an interesting try there. He defended the pawn here. I guess he didn't want me breaking through on the queen side. It could get pretty uncomfortable for him over there. One idea of taking the c pawn, by the way, was to undermine the d pawn, which at the moment is still defended by the queen, but it's also another way for my knight to get into the game through the center there. The knight is also at the moment doing a good job of defending squares around my king, though, so it would be a double-edged move to move the knight away. Anyway, he went rook c1, I went b5. I was trying to make a path for my queen to get into the game, and so it's coming in on the dark squares here. So I was happy with this idea. He plays h4, and I play queen a5. So that was the thing in this position. How do I activate my pieces? And it took me a long time to come up with this plan, so I'm pretty happy with it, and it seems to have worked. Let's see, b5, h4, queen a5, h5. So he keeps marching his h-pawn forward, and but I managed to take on a3 with the threat. The rook is threatening to bring the rook here to g3 and win his queen, so he doesn't have time to push that pawn one step further. And well, also, as we saw in the game, even if he gets in another pawn push, it just gets this pawn out of the way, and he still has to get this one through. So he's still a few moves away from scoring some damage. Let's see. So he went bishop f4 here, which defends this square. Maybe he should have tried bishop to h4, because bishop f4 left the d-pawn hanging. So I grabbed that because I thought bringing the knight in with some threats will keep his pieces tied down as well. So I'm just trying to figure out how to optimize my counterattack here. But the knight also can go to this square, which is pretty handy. Let's see. He went on with h6. He pushed on with g7. And now, before I can move the knight in, I need to do something about the king. Actually, I don't. I didn't notice my queen was still guarding the f8 square. So I was really worried about rook to f8 check, and he would just get a queen there. But right now, if he plays that, I could just take it. So king to c7 wasn't strictly necessary at this point, but that's why I played it. Let's see, he brought his other rook over to f1. Now things are starting to pile up here, but now I have this knight f5 move to interfere with the rooks. Let's see, he played bishop back to h2, and I decided just to liquidate here. This pawn is protected twice, but I'll get a pawn in exchange for giving up this knight. And then I just have a bunch of extra pawns. Yeah, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Well, 5. Say he captures this one. I still have 5 pawns, and he only has 2, and his pawns are hanging, and his king is exposed. So this is just a winning position for me. He didn't bother to take the pawn. He tried rook to f3 here. Oh no, it was my turn here. That's right. His last move was yeah, I played knight takes g7. He played queen takes g7. So it's my turn here, and I played rook to f3, and then he resigned. Actually, the chess engine points out that I can win with rook takes c2. I was a bit worried about this move, right? He can bring his rook down, and you know, this, we both are at each other's throat here. But it turns out that this position has a forced mate. So queen e3 check. If the king comes back in this direction, then you know, I can come in with the queen and the rook and mate him. So the king runs in this direction, and then I still come down with the queen, and he blocks. Then I have queen here check, and he has to resign because of the queen check on this diagonal. The king has no moves, and if he blocks with the queen, I will take it. So anyway, that was a fun game, a nice end to it. Let's see, he took queen to g7. I just played rook to f3 to stop his rook from coming down and harassing me, and he decided to resign at this point. So not too soon. I still have a pretty significant winning edge here. Anyway, interesting game. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. Bye.